Okay, so World War II is probably one of the most talked about in certainly historical background, also in politics, and we see many of the effects today. What I'm going to attempt to do is a very brief overview of World War II, some of the factors, how did it start, some of the major battles that changed the course of the war, and then finally, what were some of those consequences. So first off, why did World War II break out? And first we're going to deal with the European theater, and then we're going to move over to the Pacific theater. So the biggest chunk is going to be the European theater. It has a lot of different moving parts. So why did World War II break out? Well, we certainly have the growing power of the Nazi Party, but I dealt with that in a separate section. What we have is just a very quick overview is really comes down to several factors. One being the Versailles Treaty. Essentially, the Versailles Treaty put on the shoulders of Germany that it was to blame for World War II. And they had to basically admit that they started the First World War. Now, uh, so first off, they're blamed for it. They also have their army reduced to 100,000. They cannot have planes. They cannot have submarines. They cannot have tanks. They can only have 100,000 infantry. That means in the modern world, after World War I, that they would not be able to defend themselves. When you have the Soviet Union that is coming out of certainly World War I, you have Great Britain, France, who can have air forces, tanks, large militaries. There's just no way that Germany is going to be able to defend itself if another war is to break out. But you also have the reparations being put on the shoulders of Germany as well that they're going to have to pay off. So this really didn't sit well with the German people, and they really had a great resentment for the European powers. Now, at the end of the war, they thought that the Americans would at least maybe be able to have a more peaceful terms that Germany would be able to accept, but that was not the case. The Europeans, very angry after the um, basically an entire generation of their population had been destroyed, and so they tore Germany to pieces. And so after World War I and the growing of power, and certainly once Hitler came to power, they really wanted to expand their territory because it had been cut to pieces after World War I. They had lost some land, they had lost some resources, so they wanted that land and resources back. There were peoples in these regions, like this is Datenland, even to the east of Germany, that they recognized themselves as Germans, but they no longer belonged to the Germany that they may have grown up in. So they wanted to reclaim that land, and that's certainly a major push under Adolf Hitler. But we'll get to that in another second. Um, Leading up to that, also, you have the redrawing of European borders that ignored growing nationalistic groups. And I already mentioned that Germany was being redrawn to a much smaller scale, ignoring that there were actually Germans in the places they were drawing up. But there are also other regions throughout the Balkans, as well as where the war initially started with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in the Slavic region. Therefore, drawing up those maps, they did change, for example, some of these areas. You have the introduction of Poland, you have a lot of other different countries being drawn up, and completely ignoring the fact that some of these nationalistic groups were being ignored. So, with these redrawing of Europe, you have a bunch of different countries, but they really didn't think, the leaders at the time, being, of course, under the United States, France, and Britain, they ignored these factors. And so you have the growing sentiment of nationalism, which had been growing certainly since the 1800s and even prior to that point. These groups were being ignored, and so they wanted a piece of their land. And generally, after World War I, violence and through the force of arms was the popular method in getting this accomplished. So many people did fight certainly during World War II, and there were revolts and certain riots going on that used arms and violence to get their cause. People are going to fight for an independent country during World War II, which some of them will be disappointed, some of them will be rewarded. But this didn't help the situation to cause a peaceful transition after World War I. And so many of these people are going to try uh, get their lot, their nationalistic group, a piece of the pie. And then finally, we have the League of Nations, and the international community lacked strength. The League of Nations essentially is useless. Um, Essentially, all these countries that belong to the League of Nations, which excludes the United States, which thought of this idea under Woodrow Wilson, they did not pass this League of Nations membership into their Congress. And so as a result, um, they did not become the leading body of this League of Nations. Also, the other nations who were involved, they did not really have much power within the League of Nations. And in fact, that's a core problem within the League of Nations itself. Any sort of action is voluntary. If you want to strap on sanctions to a country because you don't like what they're doing, completely voluntary. Let's say, for example, Italy wants to put sanctions against Germany. France doesn't have to do it, and neither does any other country belonging to the League of Nations. And so, if there's any sort of offensive action going on in Europe, strapping on sanctions is completely voluntarily by any of these groups. If you want to threaten force, or even go to war with another group, to encourage them to stop whatever they're doing, for example, Hitler rearming Germany, completely voluntary. And nobody's going to support these actions with money either. There isn't a pool, and there really isn't any sort of cause to go through with any sort of actions the League of Nations does. So it's very, very weak. It's essentially a group that doesn't have any teeth. Nobody's going to listen to you, no one's going to do anything about it, and so it's largely ignored. But also, the international community lacks the strength and willingness to step up to the plate and stop the actions of Adolf Hitler or Mussolini in Italy and various other different groups in Europe at this time. The United States, for example, had essentially believed that they did not want any part in European affairs. They became isolationist in the sense that they were not going to deploy military forces around the world. And so they're out of the scene. The European powers, they have to deal with these growing forces, and they deal with it in a variety of different ways. But the entire world had suffered a Great Depression. They don't have the disposable income to raise forces. They don't have the budget to wage a war, which potentially could be another 4 or 5 year war. So this is a problem. They had just come out of probably one of the most horrific wars they've ever experienced. You can just imagine millions of people dying in a period of 4 or 5 years. That's a lot of people, and nobody wants to repeat that. It's going to take some time for people to be willing to do such a thing again. This is in the course of about a decade. Now, the Great Depression doesn't help things, but nobody's really willing to devote the manpower, the money, and the sacrifice to go to war again. So nobody's really willing to go forth and stop Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and Franco in Spain and various other different powers in Europe. So that doesn't help the situation by any means. Alright, so some of the key events prior to World War II is in 1933, with Adolf Hitler coming to power, Germany starts to rearm. They start building tanks, in secret mainly. They start building Air Force, also in secret. Much of these devices were disguised as tractors for farming or passenger planes that could easily be converted to bombers. So this is going to be the start of the rearmament process. Now in 1936, the Rhineland, this is part of the region that was taken away from Germany. And so what they do is they occupy with their newfound military force. Now, this military force has expanded far beyond 100,000. They're looking more towards 500,000 individuals. Now, everybody knows that this force is growing. They know they're building military arms, they're expanding their army. But once again, in 1936, they're not willing to go to war or strap on sanctions. So they sit by and they watch. 1936, this army invades the Rhineland, which is basically to the west of Germany at this time. So they retake that. This is a foreign territory of Germany. Nobody really argues with this. They're fine with it. Essentially, it was a part of Germany. They did consider themselves Germans, and so as a result, you don't see too much flack or flare about this action. Now, however, the next action, Hitler starts talking how they're going to retake Austria and also Czechoslovakia, regions that they claimed were part of Germany. And this is going to cause some big flack. Czechoslovakia was made a country outside of World War I, and so they see this as Germany is growing. This might be a stage to put a stop to this. And so, at first, France and the Soviet Union promised to protect Czechoslovakia. Soviet Union has ties with Czechoslovakia. They consider some of those people also Soviet citizens. France does not want Germany to expand. France had suffered heavily after World War I, or during World War I rather. And so they didn't want Germany to grow even more powerful. So British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier start to negotiate peace in Munich. The group that does not get recognized is, of course, the Czechoslovakians. They are not brought to the table. Now, through these negotiations, Hitler promises that beyond Czechoslovakia, that's all the land he needs. This is a part of his living space for Germany. In his Mein Kampf book, he basically plans out and states what he's going to do. He needs to expand Germany for living space and resources to make Germany strong again. And he says this is the last piece of land that he is going to take. So, with that, they agree. France and Britain agree, okay, this is okay. We'll secure this peace agreement. You're not going to go beyond Czechoslovakia. If you do, that's going to be a declaration of war. And Hitler agrees. So, the British Prime Minister famously says he has made peace in our time. Of course, he's going to eat his words a few years later. So, in 1938, Germany takes Austria and Czechoslovakia, occupies it with its military force, and now it is a part of Germany. What this Munich talk signaled to Hitler was that the European powers were not willing to go to war with Germany at this point, and in the future they would be unwilling to also go to war. So he was only encouraged by these actions to conquer Europe. In 1938 also, Germany is going to make talks with the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin at this point. Basically, you have a German-Soviet non-aggression act. What this means is the Germans and the Soviets are not going to attack one another for several years. It's basically a peace agreement with a time limit. So, in these talks, they also agreed that in Poland, they are going to essentially divvy up the land. So half of Poland is going to go to the Soviet Union, half of the land is going to go to Germany. And that's essentially how they come across to this peace agreement. All right. Now, with all of that going on, it basically comes to the attention that from everybody, but especially Hitler, that there's an international weakness. The United States and the European powers, and we'll take this on the other side, most people say that the United States and the European powers failed to basically stop Hitler's growth of strength. But you have to keep in mind what's going on at this time. The United States and European powers recognized that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh. They shouldn't have blamed Germany. They shouldn't have had it take ownership of starting World War I. So they're far more relaxed with Germany going about their business, ignoring the arms treaties that were instituted with the Treaty of Versailles. So they're a bit more relaxed about it. So they'll let things pass. The primary threat at this time is communism, at least for the West. They're fearful of the communism spreading, certainly the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been spreading this idea that there should be revolts in the countries all throughout the West. So he's advocating that people, workers, revolt against their governments and start a communist government. So he's advocating that people in the United States, Britain, France, including Germany, Italy, all the countries in Europe as well as the United States should have a revolt. This is generally called for as an act of war. If another country were to advocate a revolt or rebellion to overthrow the government, you would probably see that as a threat. Well, this is what's going on with the Soviet Union at this time. And so all these European powers are focused on the Soviet Union at this period of time. And so they look at Hitler as maybe being able to combat this threat of communism, because in his rise to power, he had targeted the communists and he had rooted the communists out, sent them to jail, killed them, exiled them, one fashion or another, he got them out of there. And since Germany is closer to the Soviet Union than, say, the United States or many of the other European powers like Britain and France, maybe Germany could be used to combat the Soviet Union. They would hit Germany first, and then everyone could react and take it out. So keep that in mind. Also, there's this idea that the next war is going to be far more horrible than the previous war. Very much like today, we know what happened in World War II, but World War III might end the world because we have this threat of atomic weapons. That same mentality is here after World War I. They want to prevent the next war from going hot at all costs. So they're not big advocates, not big war hawks where they want to start another war. And so if they see another war coming about, they see it, that would be the end of civilization. One of the new technologies that's come about after World War I is airplanes. Airplanes are cheap, they're effective, they're fast, they can fly over mountains, oceans. It's also been proven in the 1920s and 30s that these airplanes can carry a lot of bombs and they can probably just wipe out entire cities, which is going to be true, and they're going to figure this out in World War II especially. So with these cheap implements, they know that these airplanes could maybe just flood a country and bomb it into oblivion. And as a result, sorry about the interruption. So as a result, we have this idea that basically all war-making material, civilians, everything will be bombed into oblivion. And so that's preventing also these European powers from stopping Hitler right off the bat. And then, of course, finally, the economic viability of the United States as well as the European powers discouraged warfare. The United States and the European powers are suffering from the Great Depression. As a result, they don't want to throw themselves into another war. War is expensive. The economic viability of these countries isn't at a healthy state, so they're not too encouraged to get themselves involved in a war and potentially cause a greater depression after the war. And so as a result, all these factors are preventing these powers from getting involved in this war. However, despite all of this, they are still going to go to war, of course. All right, World War II begins. September 1st, 1939, Germany is going to invade Poland. And so that is going to be the official beginning of World War II. Shortly after their invasion, September 3rd, Great Britain and France are going to declare war on Germany. So at this point, Great Britain and France are going to be mobilizing their armies, their air forces, their navies to prepare for war. Now, on September 17th, 1939, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the east. Now, the reason that Germany invades Poland is, in part, this is an agreement with the Soviet Union, but this is, once again, living space. He was ensured that Great Britain and France weren't going to declare war on Germany. He is wrong in this prediction. But nevertheless, Poland falls within a month. This is incredibly fast, and I'll get into why it falls so fast in a second. But everyone is shocked by how quickly Germany is able to take Poland. They're also shocked by the Soviet Union. This part of the agreement was a secret. The Non-Aggression Act between Germany and Soviet Union was not a secret. So everyone knew that these guys were going to be friends, for a time anyway. Now, after the invasion of Poland and conquering Poland, Germany starts to invade other regions. Now he is at war with Britain and France. He didn't believe that this was going to happen, but now the situation has arrived. So in April 1940, Germany is going to invade Denmark and Norway, which were neutral at this point. They had not declared war on Germany. Now, on May of 1940 is going to be when Germany actually invades France. And from May to June is going to be the course of this war. Only 1 month is France going to be completely taken out. And I'll explain why it falls so quickly here in a second. On June 10th, 1940, Italy declares war on Great Britain and France. And so now you have Germany and Italy against France and Great Britain. After the war with France, Germany is going to start their campaign against Britain, which is going to be the Battle of Britain. And I'll get to that here in a second too. So why did Germany see this early success in World War II? First off, it's a new type of warfare that is going to be called Blitzkrieg or lightning warfare. What Blitzkrieg is you use the infantry, the tanks, and the Air Force communicating with one another towards one overall objective. What you're going to have is the tanks in the center, in the front. They're going to punch a hole in the defensive line, whether it be a wall, other tanks, or any sort of bunkers or fortifications. So they're going to go ahead and remove that. You're going to have infantry in vehicles on the sides of these tanks or behind the tanks, and they're going to secure basically objectives, whether it be a road system, a railroad, and the vehicles are going to allow them to go as quickly as the tanks. And then you're going to have the Air Force in the air bombing any targets ahead of this entire force. So with that, you have a very quick moving force. You have planes that can go hundreds of miles per hour. You're going to have tanks that can go certainly 20 to 30 miles an hour. Trucks with infantry are also going to be at that speed. So everything's moving at a similar speed. There are going to be radios within all of these tanks, all of these vehicles, and certainly the planes as well. And so the groups on the ground can actually direct planes to bomb certain targets, and everyone's in sync. This was not the type of warfare that many other different groups were prepared for. For example, French tanks and British tanks did not have radios in every single one of their vehicles. Tanks could not communicate with other tanks, so they used hand signals or flags, very reminiscent of a medieval type of communication device. This was not working very well, and certainly with all the smoke and all the chaos of war, this was not going to work very effectively. So the Germans could communicate with one another very easily, and everyone was working together for one goal, and they could move this force very fluidly and quickly and react to anything that the enemy could throw at them. What this allowed the Germans to do is take out tank formations. They could overwhelm them, take it out from the air, for example, and just keep moving and cutting off supplies, and the enemy wouldn't be able to react quickly enough to stop the Germans. So that's essentially how the Germans were able to take Poland in a matter of weeks, and then of course France in a matter of a month. Certainly there was some fighting going on by resistance forces or French army forces after that month had gone by, but it was really very small. So another reason why Germany saw so much success was the European powers were completely unprepared economically and militarily. The British, during the period of time from 1937 onward, were preparing its air forces. Its navy was very competent, and they were preparing the defense of the island, Great Britain. Their air forces were very competent and on par with the German Air Force, but their tanks was really lacking at this time. The French had the best tanks, they had a lot of armor, but they didn't have enough firepower to really penetrate a lot of the German tank armor. So as a result, much of their equipment was not nearly as good as what the Germans had. Um, in addition, there wasn't a whole lot of communication between the British and the French. Their military planning was separate, their communication was separate, and as a result, they just couldn't mount an effective defense against the Germans and slow it down. So as a result, Germany is going to be successful very quickly in this first phase of the war. But of course, that is going to shift. So some of the turning points of the war. One is going to be the Battle of Britain, which is going to be July to October of 1940. What the Battle of Britain is the German planners had decided that to take Britain, they needed to first remove its air force. So the German Air Force was used. They would use their bombers, their fighters to go over and bomb the air forces, the airfields, manufacturing facilities, and just try to find any sort of fighter force out there. And they were very successful at this, to a point. They did this for about a month, but then Britain sent a bomber force at night and bombed Berlin. Hitler got angry. Hitler then decided that bombing was going to then take place in London. The Royal Air Force was actually on the brink of collapse. They were exhausted. They were flying hours upon hours upon hours. And so as a result, their pilots were just completely exhausted. A lot of their planes had been destroyed. They weren't able to produce enough to replace these fighters. They were basically keeping on par. And so as a result, because of the shift in targets, then the British Royal Air Force was able to recover. They were able to get some sleep. They were able to repair planes. They were able to build more planes and bring up a fresh force. Now that the Germans were bombing London, their air force was not being targeted. So this is one of the examples of when Hitler is going to take over military decision making in World War II and basically end any sort of hope of German victory. If he had not intervened, then potentially Britain might have collapsed. It might not have had an air force. Of course, hard to say what would happen next, but regardless, this is going to be one of the many instances where Hitler overrides his German generals. And he's encouraged to do this time and time again because at the early point in the war, he had advocated for the invasion of Poland, which his commanders said they were not ready. All the way from the army to the air force were not ready. He told them to do it anyway. They won. And they did the same thing with France, and everyone was surprised how quickly they were able to take all these locations. But as a result, he's going to be encouraged that he knows better than his generals. In this case, he did not. The next battle, El Alamein, this is in North Africa. Basically, after the Battle of Britain, Britain is going to try to tackle North Africa and remove essentially these powers from Germany. What Italy had done is Italy since it's allied with Germany, had invaded North Africa. They were jealous of the victories that Germany was experiencing. And as a result, they are going to invade North Africa, try to take some oil fields, and remove the British from North Africa. They failed miserably. It was a complete and utter failure. Keep in mind that Britain is fairly isolated in North Africa. They have to get through the Mediterranean, which is controlled by the Italians and the Germans with submarines and also surface ships. They're going to run the gauntlet to get supplies to this region. The British are able to support the North African theater. They're able to supply these forces. And since they defeat the Italians, Germany is going to send in Erwin Rommel, probably one of the better generals that Germany had at this time. And so when he set in, he actually almost collapses the British forces down there. What saves them, essentially, is additional reinforcements, but also the Germans had outstripped their supplies. They invaded too quickly, they didn't have enough fuel, they ran out of fuel, and so they had to return back. This is going to be a problem for the British as well. They're both essentially trying to figure out how quickly they can advance. In the end, Rommel makes a mistake at El Alamein. The British are going to defend El Alamein, and essentially at that point he exhausts his forces. And from that point on, the British, with the help of the Americans at this point, are able to push Rommel out of North Africa, opening up a theater of war to Sicily, Italy, knocking them out of the war. Another big battle of Stalingrad, which has been made famous by countless books and movies. This is, of course, at this time, the Soviet Union is engaged in warfare with Germany. This is another example of Hitler not really understanding the course of this importance of this city. Basically, he focuses on Stalingrad because it has the name of Joseph Stalin attached to it. And so he wants to take Stalingrad and basically be humiliating to the Russian people. Many of the German generals wanted to just avoid it and go for the oil fields. And that would have been certainly more impressive, because within the first couple months, Stalingrad had been bombed to oblivion. There was nothing left in Stalingrad. So it really didn't hold much value. It's going to be one of the bloodiest battles throughout the entirety of World War II. But the Soviets are going to win over, and Hitler loses a whole army. We're talking a lot of equipment, a lot of men just lost fighting over this city that doesn't have any value because it's just been completely destroyed. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviets and the Germans are going to be engaged in July of 1943 to August of 1943 at the Battle of Kursk. This is the largest tank battle in the world. We're talking more than 6,000 tanks being involved. The Russians completely outnumbered the Germans. The Germans are going to take out more tanks than the Russians, but the Russians can replace these tanks. And so as a result, through attrition, the Germans are going to lose. And then finally, we have D-Day on June 6, 1944. This is going to be an invasion of American and British and Canadian forces onto the beaches of Normandy, establishing a beachhead and then closing in on Berlin from the west. And this is going to seal the end of certainly the Third Reich at this point, because they're having to deal with the Soviets on the east and now the Americans, British, and Canadians on the west. All right, so why did Germany lose the war? First off, the opening of a two-front war. They were very successful in taking Europe. They had failed the Battle of Britain, which Hitler has a lot of responsibility on that one. But then after defeating or being defeated by Britain at the Battle of Britain, he then turns his attention to going after the Soviet Union. Now, At first, he planned on the invasion in April, but Italy started to invade Greece, and they failed at that because the British were defending Greece, and they failed that battle. So as a result, they are going to ask for help, and Germany comes in with its force, defeats the British at Greece, but that delays the invasion till June of 1941. And so, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, they are very successful at the very beginning, but then since it started in June, it brings it much, much closer to dealing with the winter in the Soviet Union, which is incredibly cold. And this was, once again, another time of being probably one of the coldest winters in about a century. You have certainly a very cold season with Waterloo, with Napoleon, and then once again, 100 years later, we have a very cold winter with the invasion from Germany. So the big mistake was opening a two-front war. The German generals said never have a two-front war. Take Britain out first, and then we can invade the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union was a part of this issue with his Mein Kampf. He viewed the Russians as subhuman. He was very racist. And as a result, the Soviets were not on the same level as the Germans in his point of view. He saw it would be an easy victory, and so he opened the war. In his invasion towards Moscow, he believed that he could get there with plenty of time, and he saw two other armies. He had a Central Army, a Northern Army, and a Southern Army. The Central Army advanced very quickly, but the Northern and Southern ran into some resistance. And so he stopped his invasion force in the center to send troops up to the north and south to bring them back up to par. This was a mistake because they easily could have gotten to Moscow and wreaked havoc there. But unfortunately, that's not going to work for him. And so the Russian winter comes in, goes down to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It freezes the oil of many of the vehicles. The soldiers have spring coats, not winter coats, so many of them freeze to death. Planes, their engines freeze as well, so nothing's really working on the German side. And then the Soviets bring in a tank, a T-34, which is far superior to any tank that the Germans have at this point in the war. And so, as a result, the Soviet Union entering into the war basically seals the deal for the Germans at this point. So the Soviet Union is a big cause in why the Germans lose the war. The German army and the German Air Force, 2/3 of its forces were fighting the Soviets, 1/3 were fighting the British and the Americans. And so as a result, that is going to basically end it for Germany. And some would argue the Soviet Union is a cause for Germany to lose World War II all by itself, which there's a very strong argument for that. I'm sure British and Americans and Canadians, many other different groups of people don't like to hear it, but they did have a major, major impact on Germany throughout World War II. They lost the most, they fought more of the German army and German Air Force, they had good equipment, they had quite a bit of an impact on Germany throughout this conflict. Also, Hitler is going to declare war on the United States in December 1941, shortly after Japan bombs Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. That was completely unnecessary for Germany. They didn't have to do that. Now, regardless, the United States probably would have declared war on Germany anyway, but he didn't wait for the United States to do that. So we can have a notch saying that Germany and Hitler didn't help the situation. Also, Germany had some rather poor economic decisions. He believed that World War I was lost due to the fact that the German people were demoralized because they had wartime production. And so he didn't allow for a full mobilization of Germany for the first few years of the war. He believed it would demoralize the women. In fact, the women weren't allowed to work. All they were allowed to do is make babies. That was their job in Hitler's mind, and there were laws put into place to do so. And so Germany wasn't producing the amount of tanks and aircraft that were necessary to conduct a war. They certainly weren't enough to conduct a one-front war, but definitely not two fronts. So while Germany might be making 200 tanks a month, the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain were making far more than that. In fact, Germany would make 17,000 tanks throughout the entirety of the war. Soviet Union would make 50,000 T-34s. United States would make 50,000 Sherman tanks. That's already 100,000 tanks that they're going to have to compete with when they only have 17,000 tanks. Big problem. In 1943, Hitler is finally going to cave. He's going to have a member, Albert Speer, be ahead of the economic condition. And so they then reach in 1943 full-time wartime production, which by 1943 they've already lost the war. It's far too late. They cannot keep up with what the Americans and the Soviets and the British are all making at this point. And then finally, Hitler's ideologies impacting the war. I've already stated that he probably sealed the deal for Germany with the Battle of Britain, changing targets. He invaded the Soviet Union. He also has the Holocaust going on. He is shipping Jews into Poland or out of Poland and all around Europe using precious gas to ship Jews and other undesirables, according to Hitler, to all of these camps to kill them. And this precious fuel could have been used for tanks or planes or any other sort of wartime supply problem. He also could have used the people of Ukraine to fight a war against the Soviet Union. They were starving under the Soviet Union. They had a lot of their people killed off by Joseph Stalin. They did not care for the Soviets, but then when the Germans came in, they actually celebrated the Germans coming in. But then the Germans turned around and started rounding up Jews, executing any communists and Jews, and then ending any sort of help they might have gotten from the local population. They might have been able to help, certainly, the Germans deal with the cold weather at that time. But as a result, that's not going to happen. He also keeps spending Germany's economy to spend on projects that are not going to win him the war. He wants big, heavy tanks that are resource heavy, which they don't really need. They build these heavy Tiger tanks that use a lot of gas and bigger weapons. They developed the first jet fighter, but he wants it used as a bomber instead of a fighter. And so there's a lot of decisions that Hitler decides he's going to spearhead. And as a result, many of these technologies that could have helped Germany, in fact, are used poorly. And that's due to Hitler. So why did the Allies win the war? Big time economic output. Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941 to August of 1945. This act is going to supply the Soviets, the British, as well as the Americans, the tools they need to fight this war. They are going to allow, basically, let's use Britain as an example, to have fighter planes or bomber planes or tanks, and they'll be paid after the war is complete. So they can just ship this equipment to these groups of people. Now, this is prior to the United States entering World War II. Remember, December 1941 is when the United States enters World War II. So they're already helping these people who are involved in this war. At this time, the United States is not sending troops or fighter pilots or bomber pilots or what have you to these combat areas. They're just supplying the equipment. Now, the reason they're doing this is because they don't see the fascist government under Hitler being okay with the American politics and economy at this time. The United States could not have traded. The United States believes in free trade. They don't want tariffs. What The fascist government was it was not a free market. Much of its production was for wartime. The United States would not have gained any good trade agreements with Germany, and that's the same thing with the Soviet Union. And so the United States really didn't want to see fascist or communist governments exist in Europe. So they're going to supply sort of the main threat is going to be Hitler at this time. So the United States, the Soviet, and the British wartime production is going to completely outpace what Germany has, and they're able to win that. But I mentioned that in the last section. The Battle of Atlantic is going to be instrumental in this wartime production. German U-boats, submarines, are going to be sinking vast amounts and quantities of ships. These ships are going to carry the planes, the bullets, the guns, tanks, and so on to the Soviet Union, to Britain, North Africa, wherever there may be combat going on. These U-boats would sink all of these ships. And so the first thing they had to deal with was the Atlantic, this transportation network. And the Germans were being very, very successful in doing so. At times they were sinking 60 ships a month. This is a huge amount of supplies being lost. So first thing, they had to figure out how to remove these U-boats. One of the things that happened during the Battle of Britain was the British sent documents, and they sent these documents over to the United States. Their fear was that Britain might fall during the Battle of Britain. They did not know at this point that Germany was going to change targets and basically screw themselves out of a victory. So they sent with them every single classified technological breakthrough they had. This meant jet technology, it meant radar, it also meant the beginning stages of a nuclear warhead, which they would use to develop their own atomic weapon, which we'll get to with the Pacific Theater. With that technological exchange, this catches up a lot of the United States technology to be on par with what the British were having. The British had very good radar, very good computers, very good jet technology. And so, as a result, they're going to use this exchange to develop what we now call sonar, basically radar underwater. So with this sonar, by late 1942, certainly by 1943, all of these destroyer ships protecting these convoys, and they're going to be using different tactics to make these convoys more difficult to sink. They're going to be able to find these U-boats, and so they're going to destroy all these U-boats that come across. As a result, sonar is going to remove the U-boat threat, and there's just nothing they can do. In conjunction with that, the Allies had much better intelligence gathering than what the Germans had. The big point was the British developed an Enigma codebreaker. This is what it was called, but basically it broke down the sophisticated radio traffic going in from all around the German war machine. So they could actually decipher every single message the Germans sent. So they could say, if Germany sends a message that we're going to send a bunch of tanks into this region, the Allies are going to know about it. And they're going to be able to intercept maybe that convoy transporting tanks, bomb that train that's transporting the tanks. And they knew exactly what was going on in the German theater. They just broke down every single message they could. So that certainly impacted a lot of the Battle of Atlantic. Any sort of messages sent from U-boats over to the German War Command, they could pinpoint where these U-boats were sending it from, what course they were using to get back home, and vice versa. And so then they could destroy these U-boats in transit. A lot of the German wartime machine was being completely destroyed by this codebreaker. So big part that's going to cause some problems. Another big problem for the Germans, but good for the Americans and the British and the Soviets, was the air war. The British and the Americans are going to participate in something called strategic bombing. Strategic bombing is the bombing of enemy territory with the aim of disrupting its economy and destroying morale. Now, the morale isn't really going to be affected too much. Now, certainly the Germans didn't care for being bombed, but the economy is going to be disrupted a little bit. The Americans are going to conduct daylight bombing raids, and the British are going to conduct nighttime bombing raids. So the Germans are going to be bombed night and day. So entire towns are going to be completely decimated. Their industry is going to be decimated as well. The United States is going to target aircraft as well as tank manufacturing centers. And at first, this type of air war was not going very well. The Germans completely decimated a lot of these air raids. They would use large B-17 flying fortresses to bomb these targets. Each one of these flying fortresses would carry somewhere around 11 individuals. The pilots, the gunners, the bombardier, navigation, the radio, all these people within these bombers. And the German Air Force became very good at destroying these bombers. In one day, for example, they shot down 60 of these flying fortresses. So if you take 60 times 11, you can get the idea that we're talking close to more than 1,000 people being lost in one day. And the American Air Force was very close to actually ending this sort of conflict. So what saved them, though, was that the United States had developed a new fighter, the P-51 Mustang, which you can see at many air shows or air races, but it was made for the British. The British used the plane, but the Americans put an Allison engine in it. It wasn't a very good engine. It was very underpowered. So what the British did was they took the American engine out and they put their British Merlin engine in that they used for their Spitfires. With that new engine, it made the Mustang faster, could climb higher. It was a very good high altitude plane, and it was very efficient. What this allowed the plane to do was actually guard the bombers all the way from England to Germany and back. A lot of fuel load. What that did was now the Americans could shoot down the planes before they actually got to the bombers, or while the bombers were around, the P-51s could at least distract the German fighters. So eventually these P-51s are going to be given the authorization to chase down any German fighter whatsoever. And this is at the very beginning of 1944. And this is in preparation for the D-Day landings. They want the German Air Force to be completely wiped out of the sky by June 6, 1944. And that is actually accomplished. They start bombing airfields, they start shooting down these planes, they target their fuel supply, and so by certainly May, the German Air Force is pretty much wiped out. From that point on, you're getting maybe 100 planes total that might be able to get into the air versus maybe 5,000 American planes, and that's not counting potentially British planes as well in the air. What this gave was complete air superiority for the Americans and the British, and they could send their fighters down to the ground, give close air support to their army units. They could blow up any sort of communications, tanks, artillery, anything. So this allowed the Allied forces complete air dominance in Europe, and this was affected on the Eastern Front as well. Now, as far as the bombers' capability of disrupting the economy, that really didn't work out too much. By the end of the war, there was a study made, and it was determined that the German economy wasn't disrupted too much by these bombing campaigns. They basically moved their factories all over the place and kept them in secret so they were safe from the bombers. And then finally, one of the big reasons why the Allies won the war was cooperation. The Soviets, the British, and the Americans were working together on a grand strategy on how to pick apart the Germans. For example, the British and the Americans, they planned to do the D-Day. The Germans were being attacked on both sides. Certainly there was a closer relationship with the Americans and the British than the Soviets, but regardless, all these powers did communicate in one form or another to tear apart the Germans. The Germans and the Italians, as well as the Japanese later on, however, did not communicate. They were basically left to their own devices to conduct their campaigns however they saw fit, and there really wasn't that cooperation or alliance system in place. And so cooperation is a big key with how the Allies were able to win this war. All right. So with that, the war in Europe is going to end on May 8th, 1945, and Hitler is going to commit suicide, and so from that point, that ends the war in Europe. So very quickly, we have the Pacific War. Japan was engaged in warfare with China since 1937, so this is prior to World War II. The reason why they were doing this was the Great Depression hurt their economy, as it hurt much of the world economy. And so their idea to avoid this sort of Great Depression was to secure land and resources in order to recover and make sure that they may potentially be able to survive another Great Depression later on down the road. And so they invaded China, taking territories all throughout China. There are many stories of war crimes, some would argue genocide, and so these stories would reach American shores, and many Americans did not care for what Japan was doing. But also, they would continue their war into China. Now, the United States at this time, it is still suffering from the Great Depression, and they saw if they could trade with Japan and China, they might be able to recover out of this Great Depression easier. And so in 1940, they threatened an oil embargo against Japan. What that would mean is they would not be able to fly their planes, have their ships go to their targets. Their tanks would also be unable to get to their targets as well. And so that would effectively mean Japan has to end their war. But also in the beginning of 1941, America decides to freeze Japanese financial assets and trade with Japan. So if Japan had any sort of banking or financial assets in the United States, they could no longer access those financial assets, and then the United States is going to stop trade with Japan altogether. So with the oil embargo and unable to trade with the United States, that caused a huge supply problem for Japan. And so they reached a decision whether to cease the war or continue the war. And they saw that they could not stop the war, and so they decided planning for the attack on Pearl Harbor. So, on December 7th, 1941, they are going to attack Pearl Harbor. Their main objective is to destroy the battleships and destroy the carriers at Pearl Harbor and the oil supply. What that would do would make it so that the American fleet in the Pacific would not be able to attack the Japanese. And so as a result, they could go on with their business. They did sink quite a few battleships, but the carriers were not there, and the Japanese failed to attack the oil. The reason why they failed to attack the oil is their first two waves were to destroy the ships. The third wave was to destroy the oil. But by the end of the second wave, the Americans had woken up. They had manned the defenses. They had planes in the skies, and they didn't want to risk any more losses to the Japanese. And so they would leave Pearl Harbor from that point intact. As far as the perspective of Japan, one, they wanted to secure land and economic viability in the Pacific to weather any sort of economic issues that may arise, like a Great Depression. But they were also being educated by the West. They had gone to schools in Britain and France, as well as the United States. And they learned the histories of each of these countries. And they recognized that they had expanded into Africa, the Philippines, around Asia, certainly, and of course North and South America. And they expanded due to economic concerns. And so their perspective was they were following the Western example. This was one of the reasons why they're invading China, and then later they would invade a lot of U.S., British, German, and other sort of territories in the Pacific. What they hoped was this attack on Pearl Harbor and a lot of the territories in the Pacific would encourage an end to the oil embargo. They did not want a prolonged war with the United States. They thought that if they attacked, removed the naval fleet, this sort of engagement would end very quickly. The United States may be frightened out of this war, and they would be able to reestablish oil trade and financial assets. However, that was not to happen. On June 4th, 1942, you have the pivotal battle in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway. Essentially, the Japanese would attack Midway. The United States would intercept transmissions, and they figured out that the Japanese were sending its fleet to Midway, and so the Americans would send its fleet to Midway to counter this attack. So intelligence here, again, is a very big impact on the war. This is going to be the first battle in which the fleets of the Americans and the Japanese do not see each other at any point during this battle. It is all going to be taken over through the air war. And so the Americans are able to sink 4 of the carriers of the Japanese. The United States loses 2 carriers, although one is going to be able to be recovered and repaired and used later on in the war. Because Japan loses 4 of its carriers, it is completely unable to recover. It loses its initiative, and they're not able to go on the offensive from this point onward. So from 1942 to August of 1945, they're on the complete defensive. Now, the American strategy at this time is called an island hopping campaign. The Americans realized they did not need to take every single island in the Pacific and root out any Japanese. What they decided to do was take islands that might be important to the air war. This is completely a naval and an air force type of war. And so they're going to take islands they can put an airport on. They're going to use that airport to bomb any sort of Japanese in the surrounding area, disrupt their trade or supply chain, and they're going to move on. So they take Guadalcanal, for example, New Guinea, they take some islands in Saipan. Eventually they're going to get to Okinawa and Iwo Jima. The air war is going to be at the top. They're going to institute a blockade around Japan using submarines, as well as surface vessels like battle cruisers and destroyers. They are going to use these airfields, for example, in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, to bomb the mainland Japan. Now, they're going to use the lessons they used in certainly European theater. They're going to use their bombers to bomb any sort of war-producing centers in Japan. And eventually they are going to run out of targets. They have completely removed any sort of military target they can find on the surface. Now, some of these caves in Japan are going to be producing some war materials, but the Americans didn't know about that. From that point, they're going to start firebombing the cities. So, for example, they're going to drop incendiary bombs that is going to light, the biggest example, Tokyo on fire. Much of their buildings are combustible, made of wood, for example. And so they incinerate Tokyo, and Tokyo in its first raid is going to lose about 100,000 people. But then, at this point, there is the planning on invasion of mainland Japan. And the estimates are that the United States will lose potentially 500,000 soldiers. And that's not something they want to do. 500,000 troops is essentially how much the Americans lost in the entirety of World War II. They don't want to lose or bump that number up to potentially 1 million throughout the entirety of World War II. But President Truman at this time gets word that they have detonated an atomic bomb that might be able to seal the deal for the United States against Japan. And so with that information, he is going to authorize the bombing of Hiroshima using the first atomic bomb. Now, this is going to happen on August 6, 1945. When they dropped the bomb, the crew had no idea what it was going to do, including the scientists didn't really know what was going to happen. This is the first time they used the atomic bomb. So they're flying at about 40,000 feet. The smoke plume from this atomic bomb is going to rise to about 30,000 feet. And the effects of the atomic bomb, the Americans had no idea what was going to happen to the people. Some of these people are going to be completely disintegrated, no sort of evidence that they were even there. Some people are going to have radiation poisoning, their skin peeling off. The Americans at first thought this was basically propaganda until, of course, they reached the shores of Japan and actually saw this for themselves. August 8th, 1945, the Soviet Union is going to enter the war. They do take some territories in Asia for the Soviet Union. And on August 9th, 1945, they had not heard of a Japanese surrender. And so as a result, they drop another atomic bomb on Nagasaki. And shortly after that bombing, Japan surrenders. So the official surrender is going to be August 15th, 1945, officially ending the war. So that's World War II in a very quick synopsis. There certainly is far more that I can talk about, but I think that is enough.